Welcome everyone. We are going to have a very interesting episode related to combat sports with the very expert of the theme. Our guest has done his PhD in Loughborough University. He's working as a principal lecturer in School of Sport and Health Sciences in University of Brighton. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest, Dr. Alex Channon. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you very much, Ollie. Yeah, it's really nice to be here on the podcast. As you say, I'm a principal lecturer at the University of Brighton. I teach across sport studies, physical education, sport management, sports science. It's a huge interest of mine is in the social scientific research on combat sports. So excited to have a good conversation with you about that today.
Yeah, so I think you had a really interesting part where you are an article where you are making distinction between fighting and violence. Could you tell more about that?
Absolutely, yes. So this is something that I've been working on for a few years with a colleague of mine, Christopher Matthews, at Nottingham Trent University, also in the UK. We started working on this sort of theme of how people who practice martial arts and combat sports think about violence as a philosophical theme, as a moral issue, as something that in certain ways shapes their practice. And we started thinking about this while we were doing our PhDs, really. So back in 2010, 2011, that sort of period of time when we were finishing our PhDs, we wanted to talk about this, and we wanted to make this, one of the focuses that we worked on moving forwards. And a few years later, we finally got around to actually doing something on it, which usually happens in academia, sidetracked with other things. We settled on this idea of looking at how people who practice combat sports and other heavy contact sports, how they think about the idea that what they do is violence. Because if you ask people who are not within these subcultures, who don't do these activities, generally the public perception of sports like boxing, mixed martial arts, even rugby, is that they're very violent sports. And one of the things that we found when we did this, or made this part of our research efforts, was that actually a lot of people inside these sports, they don't share that belief. They actually, challenge it quite strongly. This is not violence, or I'm not a violent person, or this isn't real violence. So they'd say these kind of things, and this crops up in a lot of the research on combat sports for sure, but on other heavy contact sports as well. This kind of uneasiness with the idea that what you're doing when you punch somebody or tackle them or collide with them intentionally in sport is violence, or is violence in the same way that fighting on the streets is violence. So this is an interesting phenomenon. How is it that people can spend, many, many hours of their life punching each other in the ring, or, learning how to choke each other unconscious on the mats, and not think that it's violence, or insist on this difference. So it's an interesting academic question. And it's one that we felt tied in quite nicely with perhaps the potential for using sport to educate people about important moral issues. Mm-hmm. So to sort of elaborate on that a little bit, if in the sports context we have this quite strong sense that what we're doing isn't violence, then perhaps this gives us a clue as to what violence is, or it gives us a way, or it invites us to think about where violence sort of begins and ends. So this is kind of the direction that we were moving in with this research idea. Firstly, trying to explain from a sociological point of view how it is that people might think that it isn't violence, and then taking that knowledge and trying to do something positive with it in a pedagogical sense to encourage reflection and learning about where violence begins and ends. So that's kind of where we started with it, and this led to a couple of publications, which I think we could probably share with your listeners if they're interested. Around how violence is defined in sport. And we wrote one paper that challenged some, at the time, some recent empirical studies that we thought had not used the concept of violence particularly well, and had sort of strayed from thinking critically about what violence actually is. And as well as that, we wrote a couple of things that were to do with the project we developed, which is called Love Fighting, Hate Violence. It's this, as I mentioned, this pedagogical sort of toolkit intervention to try and use this tacit understanding that athletes have about where violence begins and ends as a way of educating young people around anti-violence initiative, and particularly the concept of consent, which is really important in the way we think about this.
Yeah, really, really interesting, and it's. I think it's a lot about consent. Like if you look combat sports, you can think that they need to be there, but basically at any point, either one of them in a fight can just turn their back, and the referee will wave it off. So at any moment, they can just get out, but they don't want to. So I think that's usually misunderstood when people are watching that. If you want, you can get out at any point of a fight.
Absolutely, and this is really at the heart of the theoretical differentiation that we made between fighting and violence. Is in those moments that we're calling fighting, that action that we're not classifying as violence. One of the key differentiating points is that both people are there in a consensual way. So this is really important to stress this for sometimes I have this discussion and people can't quite get past but punching someone is always violent. A punch is always a violent act. Well, if the act involves a violation of the person, if it's an unwanted thing, if it's an imposition of another's will over my own or over your own, it is experienced very, very differently to when somebody punches somebody else and they actually want to be punched. And this really, my first kind of foray into this phenomenon was when I was doing my PhD looking at gender relations in martial arts classes where men and women train together. And one of the big problems that sort of arises in those situations, as I'm sure you're aware if you've trained with women in combat sports, is that often there'll be this sort of reluctance from men to engage properly with sparring with women or training with them. And in some cases that might be appropriate. If it's a completely new person, you don't want to spar them on the first day and put them off. But if it's someone with a bit of experience, someone who wants to be pushed, someone who's getting ready for a match, you need to have a physical exchange to properly develop skills. You need to be punched. Equally, in a competitive encounter, if one person just sits down in the ring and doesn't, actually try to resist and overcome the other, then the competition is sort of evacuated of all of its meaning. It doesn't count as a proper fight. So, and these kind of stories were being reported to me by women that I was interviewing, and some men as well. That they found it very difficult to, because of the impact of gender socialization and so on. So in this context, if we take gender out of it again, in this context, people actually want to be hit. It's an important thing. It's an important part of the experience. And so by not hitting somebody, in fact, you kind of violate the purposes of them being there. And, you're sending them a message that you don't quite belong, or I don't take you or this seriously. So again, for people who haven't actually done this, who haven't tried to put themselves in these situations, this might be quite a strange thing to understand, that somebody actually wants to be punched. But there you go. That's what social research is for. We go and we lift the lid on these strange and peculiar worlds. But yes, sorry, to circle back, this was about consent, isn't it? So really, consent is the key thing here. In the boxing ring, the MMA cage, the judo mats, we want our partners to try to do these things to us. Otherwise, the sport has no meaning. Outside of those contexts, on the streets, in a bar, or in a domestic violence situation, somebody's punching or throwing or choking somebody else that doesn't want it, it might very well be the exact same action that's taking place. The same punch delivered with the same force to the same body part, but it's understood and experienced completely differently when there isn't consent. And that really is what the love, fighting, hate, violence distinction is about, is that one of these things is something that we can find a lot of positive meaning in, fighting, and the other, violence, is something that is, it's destructive, it's negative, and we want to challenge that. So, that's really where we were headed with this, this sort of distinction between the two concepts, translating that into something we can use to teach young people about consent and how it feels.
Yeah, and interesting that you said that something needs to be violated, and I guess the violence words comes from there. And I'm from Finland, and in Finnish, actually, violence is two words, and it's kind of people and power are combined. So it's kind of using power to control people in a way. And I think it also gives something about the word violence, because I think there's a power relationship that the other one has in a violence kind of more power and are using it against someone who has less power in a sense. What do you think about the power relationship?
Absolutely, yes, and this is where I think the discussion around violence can get a lot more sophisticated and can lead us into a lot of a much wider sort of area of reflection on how force, whether it's physical force, economic force, symbolic influence, and lots of different ways in which we can sort of impose our will on others in ways that might harm them or damage them. The initial paper that Christopher and I wrote is a theoretical piece published in the journal Sport and Society. We settle on this important distinction, or this important sort of two-part way of thinking about violence. One being violence as force, where we only think about the sort of manifestation of power, the direct, obviously harmful, often consequences of either physically overpowering somebody or forcing them to do something against their will in some other way. That violence as force definition, looking very much at the objective actions of the manifestation of that power. On the other hand, violence as violation, looking at the subjective experience of being part of this human relationship, which is characterized, in this case, by an uneven power relation. If we think about the fairly simplistic example, but the punch in the boxing ring is delivered between two equals, who meet on common ground within a consensual framework. As you say, one of them can opt out at any time. That's part of the norms of that. The relationship that exists between those people is not one that's defined by a sharp power differential. Meanwhile, the same punch thrown, perhaps even between the same people, in an argument outside, is about one of those people deciding to no longer respect the other's boundaries and to force them to submit to their will. So yes, absolutely, power is part of this. And that also kind of opens up the door to think, well, just because we're saying that fighting isn't necessarily violence, that doesn't mean that the things that happen in sport, the action in contact sports, is never violent. In fact, it can very well be violent. If we think about coaches pushing athletes too far, if we think about perhaps people being perhaps economically coerced, people who are only taking part in sport because there's a financial gain, but they really don't want to be there. We could perhaps characterize that as a form of violence. So, and there's lots of different avenues we can take that, particularly thinking about violence in a more sociological sense, that it's not just about the objective action of one person punching another. There's a lot more going on in the background, and absolutely power is part of that.
And maybe many people don't understand, who are outsiders, that, for example, athletic commissions, they don't allow to have fight between two who are not close enough in skills and in weight. So basically, it's kind of illegal to even have a fight if the discrepancy is too big.
Yes, and that is an interesting one, because, and I think we'll come back to this when we talk about the more recent study that I've done a bit later in the podcast, with respect to some contexts where athletic commissions don't actually operate, and some of the things that can happen then, which it leads to a lot of problems. But yes, as well as the interpersonal consent between two athletes, you also have a wider structure that oversees this, or at least you should do, in a well-developed sports infrastructure context, where there are sort of standardized and widely agreed upon principles that regulate these things and say, look, David can't consent to fight Goliath, right? We have to step in on his behalf here. That you might have all the guts in the world, but actually it maybe is a little bit paternalistic, but and digressing slightly here, I think perhaps some fighters need that kind of thing. They're too brave for their own good, sort of thing. They need that kind of regulation around it to prevent perhaps some of the those mismatches that you mentioned from taking place. So yes, interpersonal consent is very important, but it's not the be all and end all. There are other things that are in place to protect us, which in an ideal world should function effectively to mitigate against those kinds of dangerous mismatches in sport.
And if we then talk a little bit about amateur full contact combat sports, because it's interesting, people do not make living, usually don't get paid at all. Why do people take these kind of risks, which can be really big risks for nothing, basically?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And having spent a fair bit of time around the amateur MMA scene a couple of years ago, when I was doing the work that we're discussing later, I got to spend a bit of time with some of the athletes and their coaches, some of the referees as well, really important figures in this field. And hardly anyone is making money here. The referees are being paid for the evening's work they do, but they're not being paid megabucks. And unless they're working on a big international shows, it's not. They have to have a second. They have to have a job. The refereeing is not their main income. Coaches as well. They make money from running their gyms, but it's not. They're not celebrity athlete. Big earners. And of course, as you say, the athletes themselves, they're lucky if they're paid their travel expenses. Even fighting at the lower level of professional combat sports, certainly with mixed martial arts in the UK, there is very little money outside of the very top end of the sport. So yes, there must be something else that drives this. And I think we need to look into sports psychology for this. We need to look at motivational theories around. What I'm mostly familiar with in sociology is thinking about identity construction and being able to be part of a community through walking through the fire that you and your friends sort of walk through together, and using mixed martial arts or using boxing or whatever discipline we're competing in as a way to gain a kind of experience that helps you to build a positive identity and confirm a positive identity for yourself. So I wrote a paper about this a couple of years ago in the Martial Arts Studies journal, using the concept of edge work, this idea that by taking extreme risks, calculated risks and controlled risks, but still very extreme and dangerous risks, people are able to gain a kind of experience which tells them something very profound about who they truly are. It allows you to kind of place yourself in a situation that most people will never experience, a situation that most people think of perhaps as being extraordinarily dangerous and uncontrollable, and seeing, do I have what it takes to survive when I'm cast into the fire, when I'm having to rely on myself to get myself through this situation. And there's plenty of sports that provide us with examples of this kind of action. And I argued in this paper that mixed martial arts is one of them. That, we enter into this position where, we're inside a cage and the door closes and it's just me and my opponent. Yes, the referee's there as well, but trying not to be involved. And it's just us in this moment where, and this is confirmed in a lot of the research on the sport, it's very authentic. It's very, very much brings me close to the truth about myself, about my skills, about my abilities. There's nowhere to hide, and I get to learn about myself in quite profound ways in these environments. And that's an experience that, is very hard to come by in contemporary society, and even in most sports as well, where there's a lot more control. There's, you perhaps have an opportunity to hide behind teammates and so on. Not so in sports like boxing, mixed martial arts. It's very, very sort of raw. And I think that goes at least some way in explaining why do people do this, because it gives you an experience like no other. Incredibly sort of affirming, positive, self-actualizing experience, a massive emotional high, and other things as well. So that's how I would answer that question. I'm sure there are other answers as well, but that's how I would address it.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting and really resonates with my personal experiences. I have had maybe 20 full contact fights in different martial arts. And I think it's amazing also, like the kind of defense side, which usually don't get much attention, that you have an opponent who have maybe practiced decades punches and kicks, and if you can be there being calm even if you are in a tight spot, I think that's something quite amazing, feeling that you are in probably the tightest thing in your life. It's really really bad spot to be, and you are still concentrated, calm, and you can control yourself and defend. And I think that's often. Did you get any this side in your studies?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is basically the core of the edge work concept, is the idea that you deliberately place yourself in tremendous risk in order to test if you can do this, that's the affirmation that you have got what it takes to survive and to keep your cool and to stay, to stay in the moment when everything around you seems to be chaotic and threatening and out to destroy you. You can stay calm, you can stay focused, and you can do what you know needs to be done to get yourself through. This, as I say, this is a concept that's been used in a lot of sports contexts. It's been used to look at mountaineering and base jumping and free solo climbing and all these very dangerous, pretty extreme kind of sports environments. And I think it applies absolutely to the kinds of things that mixed martial arts fighters and other combat athletes as well say about it. I haven't competed in a long time in martial arts, but I do train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And one of the things that's resonated with me very much so is this sense of, when someone's, someone who's much bigger than you and better than you is sitting on top of you and you can't breathe and they've got your arm, you're surely moments from having your arm wrenched, to be able to keep your calm and not panic, and be able to know that this isn't going to kill me, and as it's uncomfortable, but I'm okay. It's one of the most sort of profound experiences, I think, to know that you can survive these kinds of encounters, and keep your mind, keep yourself focused and keep yourself protected. It's very powerful, I think, and that definitely goes a long way to explaining why people put themselves at risk.
Yeah, I've heard the phrase being comfortable, being uncomfortable. And I think that's an important skill that many people are lacking. And I think it comes really with for example, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that when you are choked, you actually need to relax, because it's not good to tense your throat. It makes it even harder. So you need to relax and just be okay with the feeling. And then if you think, some people, they are really annoyed if their nose is a little bit blocked, like, or some small things. So I think it helps in everyday life that you are like, this is pretty easy. Nobody is trying to strangle me. So yeah.
I remember when I first started training jiu-jitsu, actually, after about 3 months, I had to go to the dentist to have a lot of work done. I was in the dentist chair for about 50 minutes having all kinds of things fixed in my mouth. And I kept saying to myself, don't tap to pressure to get me through it. So I completely relate. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really nice. And then also, like, I don't know if you came up with this kind of thing, but for example, for me, after a fight, I actually feel a lot of maybe friendship with my opponent. Usually the relationship is special afterwards. Mm-hmm. Like, did you have any of these things?
Again, absolutely. And this, again, it comes through in the paper I wrote on edge work, that one of the defining features of this concept as well is that edge workers tend to recognize and respect that behavior in each other. So there's other explanations, of course, for why we feel camaraderie with the people that we spar with or we train with or fight against. But this in particular, I often hear this phrase, I respect anyone with the guts to step in the cage or to step in the ring. Anyone that can get in there and face down those demons and walk through that fire. I know how hard that is, so I respect anyone who can do that. There's this kind of sense of communitas, this shared exclusive and shared experience that goes on in these kinds of sports, that when we recognize that in other people, there is already kind of that mutuality and that bond that, yes, I know that you've obviously got the right kind of character that I value, because you've walked through that fire that I have. Equally, there's another aspect of this that's unique, I think, to combat sports when it comes to edge work, is if we see the experience of being at risk in sport as valuable. So I want to learn about myself. I want to gain these fantastic emotions. I want this incredible experience. I want to build this identity, be part of this community, and so on. If I'm doing that in base jumping, I need something tall and I need, a parachute. Or if I'm doing it in mountaineering, I need some climbing boots and a mountain range. If I'm doing it in MMA, I need an opponent, right? I can't walk down that risky path. I can't sort of work the edge, so to speak, without an opponent genuinely trying to beat me. So I need someone to enable me to experience those emotions. And likewise, I will also do the same for my opponent. So even though when we meet in the ring or in the cage, we are trying to overcome each other, and we are, for all intents and purposes, we are hostile towards each other in the context of the sport. Actually, if we step outside of the sport and look at this as a social phenomenon, we're actually working together.
Hmm.
We're actually partners, right, in creating and producing this powerful feeling of this emotional high, this connection with significant experience that we're both after. So we need each other, and we've provided a service to each other. Now, of course, that's not always going to be the case. Not every fight is going to go that way, and not every fight is going to have those meanings. And sometimes people might genuinely hate each other, or just simply not be doing it for those reasons. You're doing it to earn money, or for any number of other reasons. But when that is the motivation, and I think from what I've seen, from what I've experienced, it tends to be quite a strong one for a lot of people, then actually our opponent, there's every reason that we would want to hug our opponent afterwards, because they've just helped us to have something that we've been really excited to have. So yeah, that's how I would explain that.
Yeah, when you were explaining that, I thought there's an episode Nora has done with adventurous learning, episode with Dr. Simon Beams, and I think it a little bit relates to this, that you learn in the edge moment, in the risky moment, and I think adventures are a little bit similar to this one.
Absolutely, yeah. As I say, that the way that I've been thinking about this, the concepts I've used have been used extensively in that context as well, and it fits quite nicely. I think I'm quite pleased with the use of that concept.
Mm. And then if we move to your more recent work with the MMA, could you tell more about your new studies?
Sure. So over the last couple of years, I've been writing up and publishing the study that I did with Christopher Matthews and another chap called Matthew Hillier. Matty Hillier, he's also a fighter himself. He's fought MMA for quite a few years. So Matty joined us on the research team for that. It was a great help. So yeah, it was the three of us did this study. We did it between sort of early 2018 and mid 2019. We gathered data. It was initially intended to be a study of the work of medical professionals in a variety of combat sports, so boxing, kickboxing, and mixed martial arts. As it happened, and as qualitative studies often evolve, once they start, they take on a bit of a life of their own. We tended to get a lot more access to mixed martial arts events and a lot more enthusiasm from people who worked in mixed martial arts. So the study kind of naturally evolved to be more about MMA than others, but yet we still managed to get some data from boxing and kickboxing shows, as well as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competitions. Went to a couple of those. And the study was basically intended to find out what it's like to be a medical professional working in this context where athletes are, willfully putting themselves at risk, taking significant risks with their physical health in order to, enjoy competition and so on. And you're the person, you're the doctor or the nurse or the paramedic, the EMT, whoever it is. You're the person who's charged with keeping them safe and picking up the pieces when they do get hurt. So what is it like to do this work? How easy is it? How difficult? What kind of things enable the work? What kind of things constrain it? So that's what we set out to find. There's been quite a lot of research on sports medicine that's taken a social science perspective to look at the work of sports medics. Generally, the findings in this field suggest that it's difficult for medical professionals to work in sport, more difficult than in their normal clinical environments, mostly because the things that they want to say are not the things that athletes want to hear. For instance, I don't think you should fight today because your blood pressure is too high, or you've been concussed. This fight is over. So usually, the things that doctors and other medical staff would prefer to do are things that athletes don't necessarily want to hear, and that there are lots of other things to consider as well. But that, as a sort of a starting point, it made us very interested in how do medical professionals work in these kinds of environments.
Mm. And I think it's a little bit controversial. Usually they are working in healthcare, taking care of health, and then this event which kind of always results in some kind of small or bigger injuries. So did they find it controversial to be, or are they kind of selected just certain persons to be in this kind of events?
So the people that we spoke to and shadowed. So I should say a bit more about the study. Actually, yes, we went to fight events and we sat with the medical teams as often as we could. Sometimes we weren't able to, but most of the time we were able to sit with them throughout the event, talk to them, watch them work, and then we interviewed them as well later on. So we got quite a lot of quite close to the action and had a good good chance to learn all about what they do. Most of the time they're not selected to do the work. They're hired on a fairly ad hoc basis. So some of the people that we knew worked regularly in combat sports, and they worked in other sports as well. And they would often be they'd find work by reputation or by word of mouth, or I've worked this guy's show before, so he'll hire me again, kind of thing. So there were some kind of relationships in the field, but they were quite informal, and there wasn't a governing body that says, okay, you're the doctor who will do this show. You're the nurse who'll work at that show. It didn't really work like that. In the regulated sports, so particularly in amateur boxing, there was a bit more control. So doctors had to be part of an approved committee that would work in boxing shows. And in the higher level mixed martial arts, the professional mixed martial arts shows in the UK, there's a group called Safe MMA, who are an advisory group, medical advisory group, who sort of helped with that regulation as well, but they weren't regulating as such. So if I'm a promoter and I don't want my show to be part of Safe MMA's remit, then I don't have to, and I can hire whoever I like. So actually the way that they were securing their work was very informal, and that led to quite a diverse range of people. So there were some doctors who worked at shows. There were some shows that only had paramedics, and some shows that had medical technicians, so people who are less qualified than paramedics, ambulance drivers, basically, ambulance technicians. So yeah, there was a big diversity there, and of course that then translated into quite a diverse range of practices as well, because there's certain things that the EMTs just can't do, certain things that doctors aren't comfortable with doing, and they would want to transfer to hospital, and a really mixed bag of what actually happens on the ground at any one show, given that there wasn't any regulation to work to. As to your question, though, sorry, I'm taking the long way around.
Don't worry.
So yeah, the question was, do they find it controversial? Most of them, no. Most of them really enjoyed combat sports, and the reason they worked there was because they liked it. They wanted to be part of the scene. Some of them boxed themselves or had done MMA, or they had some kind of either personal connection as an athlete or a former athlete, or they just enjoyed it. They liked being part of the scene. So they didn't find it controversial, and they would often I asked them about this, and they often experienced this from their colleagues in hospitals. Like, oh, I can't believe that you go to this thing. How can you do that? And that they would often then try and convince their colleagues, actually, this isn't as bad as you think. It's it's controlled. There are rules. I'm making it safe, and so on. So yeah, they were generally very positive about combat sports.